Marla Whitmore and Nolan Hayes never meant to destroy a family, but their betrayal led to blood on the floor and a secret that would never be forgiven. What started as stolen glances between a man and his wife's mother spiraled into an affair, so twisted that it left lives in ruins. Elira Hayes had spent years building the perfect marriage, but beneath the surface, deception festered in the most unthinkable way. When she uncovered the truth, that her mother was carrying her husband's child, rage consumed her, leading to a night that would end in catastrophe. Some betrayals cut so deep that they can never be undone. Elira Kane had always believed she was living the kind of life others envied. At 32, she had a flourishing career as a corporate attorney, a devoted husband, and a home that symbolized years of hard work and shared dreams. She and Nolan Kane had been together for nearly a decade, married for 5 of those years. Their relationship had seen its share of challenges, but through it all, they had remained a team, or so she thought. Their home, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, was the embodiment of stability, with its manicured lawn, white picket fence, and warm interior that welcomed guests with an illusion of perfect harmony. Their seemingly ideal life took a shift when Elira's mother, Marla Henshaw, moved in. Marla had gone through a messy divorce that left her emotionally and financially drained. At 49, she was still stunningly attractive, with high cheekbones, piercing green eyes, and a confidence that drew people toward her effortlessly. Unlike Elira, who was more reserved and career-driven, Marla was charismatic, flirtatious, and unapologetically bold. She had spent most of her adult life enjoying the privileges that came with being married to a wealthy businessman, but with her recent divorce leaving her nearly penniless, she had no choice but to lean on her daughter for support. Elira didn't hesitate to offer her mother a place to stay, believing it was only temporary. She saw Marla as fragile in her grief, a woman who had lost everything and needed kindness. Nolan, too, welcomed her into their home with open arms, or at least that's what it seemed like at the time. He reassured Elira that it was the right thing to do, that family came first, and that Marla deserved a fresh start. At first, everything seemed normal. Marla integrated herself into their daily lives, helping with household chores, cooking elaborate dinners, and sharing stories over wine in the evenings. She made an effort to fit in, but there were subtle changes that Elira, caught up in the chaos of work, failed to notice. Marla had a way of drawing people toward her, and Nolan was no exception. Their interactions started as casual conversations, nothing out of the ordinary. They discussed books, music, and travel, finding common ground in ways Elira hadn't anticipated. Nolan, who had always been attentive to his wife, started spending more time with Marla. At first, it was just small things, laughing at her jokes, engaging in deeper conversations, lingering in the kitchen longer than necessary when she was around. Marla, in turn, responded with subtle touches, lingering gazes, and compliments that bordered on inappropriate. Elira, oblivious to the growing tension, often came home exhausted, her mind preoccupied with work deadlines and responsibilities. She was grateful that her mother and husband got along so well. She even joked about how they had more in common than she did with either of them. Marla played the role of the supportive mother-in-law effortlessly, keeping Elira from seeing the truth that was unfolding right under her nose. As the weeks passed, Marla's presence in the house became more than just that of a guest. She took over in ways that Elira hadn't anticipated, organizing the home, making decisions that weren't hers to make, subtly shifting the dynamics. Nolan didn't seem to mind. In fact, he seemed to welcome it. If Elira noticed anything odd, she dismissed it as paranoia. After all, this was her mother. Why would she ever suspect anything more? Neighbors and friends began to take notice of the way Marla and Nolan interacted. There were lingering glances, whispers shared in the corners of rooms, and a chemistry that was hard to ignore. but no one dared to voice their concerns, assuming that Elira was aware and simply didn't mind. What no one knew was that something far more dangerous was brewing beneath the surface. The betrayal had already begun, and by the time Elira realized it, it would be far too late. Marla and Nolan's connection grew stronger with each passing day, slipping past the boundaries of what was acceptable. At first, it was nothing more than stolen moments, small, seemingly innocent interactions that neither of them questioned. A shared glance across the dinner table, the brush of a hand when passing a coffee mug, laughter that lingered a little too long. What started as casual companionship turned into an unspoken attraction neither could ignore. Nolan, who had always been steady and predictable, found himself drawn to Marla's intoxicating energy. She was different from Elira, spontaneous, confident, and daring in ways that made him feel young again. She challenged him, made him laugh in a way he hadn't in years, and, most dangerously, made him feel wanted. He had loved Elira once, but over time, their marriage had settled into something routine, something that no longer excited him. With Elira buried in work and always exhausted, Nolan had begun to feel like an afterthought in his own home. Marla was a storm, unapologetic, wild, and untamed. She made him feel alive, and soon that feeling became an addiction. The innocent moments escalated into something much darker. Late at night, when Elira was asleep, Nolan and Marla would find themselves alone in the dimly lit kitchen, their whispered conversations turning into something dangerous. The tension between them became unbearable, and the inevitable finally happened. The first time was a mistake, or at least that's what they told themselves. A moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment. But once the line had been crossed, there was no going back. The thrill of secrecy, the risk of getting caught, only fueled their obsession. They found ways to be alone together, creating excuses and opportunities that no one questioned. While Elira worked long hours, Marla and Nolan indulged in a relationship that grew more reckless with time. Marla reveled in the power she had over him. She had always been the kind of woman who enjoyed control, and this was no different. It wasn't just about desire, it was about dominance, about proving that she could take whatever she wanted. She justified it in her mind, telling herself that Elira had never truly appreciated Nolan the way she did, that he deserved more than a wife who was always absent. Nolan, on the other hand, was drowning in guilt but unable to stop himself. He told himself it wasn't hurting anyone, that as long as Elira never found out, no harm was being done, but deep down, he knew the truth. What they were doing was unforgivable, and yet he was too far gone to turn back. The affair remained hidden for months, buried beneath layers of deception. They were careful, ensuring their secret never slipped through the cracks, but secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how tightly they are held. Marla made the first mistake. One evening, as she and Nolan stood too close in the kitchen, Elira walked in unexpectedly. The way Marla pulled back too quickly, the way Nolan's expression shifted, it was subtle, but enough for Elira to notice. A flicker of suspicion sparked in her mind, but she brushed it off. It was her mother. The thought of anything beyond harmless familiarity seemed absurd. Then came the second mistake. A misplaced piece of jewelry, Marla's gold bracelet, discovered in the pocket of Nolan's jacket. He fumbled for an explanation, claiming she had misplaced it and he had meant to return it. Elira accepted the excuse, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The third mistake was the most damning of all. A message on Nolan's phone, one he had forgotten to delete. The words were innocent enough at first glance. "I can't stop. Thinking about last night." But the contact name was what made Elira's stomach drop. Marla. The reality of what was happening in her own home was beginning to unravel before her eyes. She just didn't know how deep the betrayal went yet. Elira's world began to shift in ways she couldn't understand. At first, it was just a feeling, an unease that settled in her chest, making her restless. The odd tension between her mother and her husband had been growing, but she had convinced herself that she was imagining things. She was exhausted, overworked, and perhaps a little paranoid. But then the evidence started stacking up. The misplaced bracelet had been the first real crack in the illusion. Marla had always been careful with her belongings, and it didn't make sense for her jewelry to end up in Nolan's jacket pocket. Elira had asked about it, and both of them had laughed it off, insisting it was a silly mistake. Still, something about the way they had looked at each other in that moment unsettled her. She told herself it was nothing, until the message, it, had been a simple notification on Nolan's phone, a text that flashed on the screen while he was in the shower. Elira hadn't meant to snoop, but the words caught her attention immediately. "I can't stop thinking about last night." And beneath it, the name she never expected to see, Marla. Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen. She wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe Marla had meant to text someone else. Maybe she had misunderstood the message, but the weight in her chest told her otherwise. This was real. Something had been happening behind her back, right in her own home. That night, Elira barely slept. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of Nolan's breathing beside her. She wanted to confront him immediately, to shake him awake and demand answers. But she knew she needed proof. If she accused them without evidence, they would find a way to twist the truth. She had spent her career uncovering lies, in courtrooms, and now she was trapped in one herself. Determined to find the truth, she started watching them closely. She noticed the way Marla's demeanor had changed, how she seemed more confident, more comfortable, as if she belonged in the house in a way that Elira no longer did. Nolan was different too. He was distracted, distant, avoiding eye contact. Whenever they were all in the same room together, the signs had been there all along. She had just been too blind to see them. One evening, when Nolan had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter, Elira hesitated only a second before opening his email. Her heart pounded as she scrolled through his messages, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. At first, there was nothing. Work emails, promotions, nothing out of the ordinary. And then she found them, hidden in a folder labeled Personal. Emails from Marla. Some were vague, coded in ways that would mean nothing to an outsider. But others were explicit, filled with memories of nights they had spent together, secret rendezvous that had happened under her roof. The reality of it crushed her. This wasn't just a meaningless affair, it was something more. Something that had been going on for far longer than she had imagined. The final blow came when she discovered the medical documents. She found them tucked away in a drawer in Marla's room, a doctor's appointment confirmation, a prescription for prenatal vitamins. The words on the paper blurred as she read them over and over again. Pregnant. Marla was pregnant. And there was no doubt in Elira's mind who the father was. A scream built in her throat, but she swallowed it down, her entire body shaking. This wasn't just betrayal, it was something far worse. Her husband had not only destroyed their marriage, he had crossed a line that could never be undone. And now she had no choice but to face the truth. Her mother was carrying her husband's child. Elira sat motionless, staring at the evidence before her. The weight of the truth pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just betrayal. Her mother, the woman who had raised her, was pregnant with her husband's child. The thought made her stomach turn. How had she missed the signs? How had she let this happen right under her nose? The rage that boiled inside her was unlike anything she had ever felt before. She had spent her life believing in loyalty, in trust, in the unbreakable bond of family. But now, that bond had been shattered into something unrecognizable. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but only one thing was clear. This could not go unanswered. She needed to confront them. They needed to see the destruction they had caused. Her hands clenched into fists as she marched downstairs, her pulse pounding in her ears. She found them together in the living room, Nolan sitting comfortably on the couch, Marla standing nearby, sipping a glass of wine as if she hadn't turned her own daughter's life into a nightmare. When Elira threw the medical documents onto the coffee table, the room fell silent. Marla's face drained of color, her fingers tightening around the glass. Nolan's eyes flicked between the papers and Elira, realization setting in like a slow-moving storm. The silence was unbearable. The moment was electric with tension, an invisible force pushing against them all. Elira demanded answers, but Marla only crossed her arms, tilting her chin up in defiance. She didn't look apologetic. She didn't even look guilty. Instead, she looked victorious, as if she had been waiting for this moment, daring Elira to react. Nolan, however, wasn't as composed. He stammered, struggling to find the right words, but what excuse could he possibly give? There was nothing. He could say that would make this better. There was no explanation that could erase the betrayal. Elira saw the panic in his eyes, the fear that came with being caught. But what disgusted her the most was the way Marla barely flinched. Elira felt something inside her snap. The woman who had rocked her to sleep as a child, who had kissed her, scraped knees and told her stories about love and loyalty, had now become her worst enemy. She couldn't comprehend how Marla could stand there so calmly, watching her daughter's world fall apart without an ounce of remorse. The fury inside her erupted into screaming, accusations flying as she demanded to know how they could do this to her, how they could destroy everything she had built. But Marla had no interest in apologizing. Instead, she did something that made Elira's blood run cold. She smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a wave of nausea through Elira's body. That smile confirmed everything. Marla hadn't just let this happen. She had wanted it. She had made it happen. Nolan tried to step in, but Elira shoved him away, disgust curling in her stomach at the thought of him. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her future, had betrayed her in the most unthinkable way. And now, he was going to be a father to her mother's child. The argument spiraled into chaos. The house, once filled with warmth and love, now felt like a battlefield. Voices rose, accusations were hurled, and for the first time in her life, Elira felt the deep, uncontrollable urge to destroy something. Then it happened. Marla, standing at the top of the staircase, turned to leave, brushing past Elira with the same arrogance she had carried her entire life. But in the heat of the moment, in the blur of anger and heartbreak, something shifted. A misstep, a gasp, a moment of weightlessness before Marla's body tumbled down the stairs, each impact sending a sickening crack through the air. By the time she reached the bottom, the house had gone completely silent. The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sound in the house was the uneven rhythm of Elira's breathing, a sharp contrast to the deafening chaos that had erupted just moments before. At the bottom of the staircase, Marla lay motionless, her body twisted unnaturally, her face pale. A pool of blood was beginning to spread across the polished hardwood floor, staining it deep red. Elira couldn't move. Her mind refused to process what had just happened. Had she pushed her? Had Marla simply lost her balance? The moment had passed too quickly for her to be certain, but the result was undeniable. Her mother was broken at the foot of the stairs, and nothing would ever be the same again. Nolan was the first to react. He rushed to Marla's side, his hands hovering over her, his breaths shallow and erratic. He muttered her name over and over, as if saying it enough times would force her eyes to open. But she didn't respond. Elira's legs finally carried her forward, her hands shaking as she knelt beside her mother. A pulse. She needed to check for a pulse. With trembling fingers, she pressed against Marla's wrist, searching for any sign of life. It was faint. So faint that for a moment, she thought she had imagined it. Nolan fumbled for his phone, his voice hoarse as he called for an ambulance. Every second stretched into eternity as they waited, neither of them speaking, neither of them daring to look at each other. By the time the paramedics arrived, the house was drenched in an unbearable tension. They worked quickly, assessing Marla's condition before loading her onto the stretcher. One of them turned to Elira, his voice firm yet professional. "She's alive, but we need to move fast." Elira nodded, her throat too tight to respond. The ride to the hospital was a blur. Nolan sat beside her in silence, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white. There were no words left to say, no justifications, no excuses, only the crushing reality of what had unfolded. Hours passed before a doctor finally emerged, with an update. "She's stable," he said, his voice measured. "But there's internal bleeding. We need to operate." Elira barely managed to nod. She should have felt relief. Her mother was alive, but all she could feel was the suffocating weight of everything that had led to this moment. Nolan stood beside her, his presence unbearable. She turned to him, her voice quiet but laced with a fury that burned deep. "I want you gone." He opened, his mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to apologize, but she didn't care. "When I come home," she continued, "I don't want to see you ever again." For once, he didn't fight her. He only nodded before walking away, disappearing down the corridor. Without another word, the surgery lasted for hours. Elira sat in the waiting room, staring at the floor, feeling completely hollow. She didn't know what she wanted anymore. Did she want Marla to wake up so she could finally confront her? Or did she want the problem to simply disappear? The thought made her sick, but the anger inside her was relentless. Finally, a nurse approached. "She's out of surgery," she said gently. "You can see her now." Elira hesitated before stepping inside. Marla looked smaller than she ever had, her face pale, her body hooked up to machines. She had survived, but just barely. Then, the final blow came. The doctor entered the room, his expression unreadable. "We have one more update," he said, glancing between them. "The baby, we couldn't save it." Marla's eyes flickered open at that exact moment, her gaze locking onto Elira's. And in those green eyes, Elira saw something that sent a chill through her spine, hatred. This wasn't over. It had only just begun.